May 13th, 1981. As Pope John Paul II meets with crowds in St. Peter's Square in Rome, shots ring out, striking the Pope and shocking the world.
An attack on the Pope was something unprecedented in the 20th century, and it obviously affected people.
Following the commotion and outrage, a question arose. Could this attack have been avoided? About 60 years earlier, a young Portuguese shepherdess named Lucia had predicted it.
If Lucia was to be believed, this assassination attempt may have been prophesied by the Virgin Mary as early as 1917.
In 1917, Mary appeared 6 times in the small village of Fatima, Portugal, to 3 shepherds, Lucia and her cousins, Jacinta and Francisco. Each appearance was accompanied by a miracle witnessed by thousands of people.
People believe this is the end of the world, falling on their knee, praying, confessing their sin.
But it was only to Lucia, Jacinta, and Francisco that the Virgin entrusted a 3-part secret of profound importance, but whose vague interpretation remains compelling.
It gave rise to a whole myth, an attraction, and a passion throughout the entire world.
Some believe the secret prophecy describes nothing less than the fate of humanity.
Fatima's message was one of the common threads of the history of the Church in the 20th century.
The Vatican, however, has remained silent, inexplicably locking away the Virgin's prophecies. But why? Could her messages have changed the course of history?
The spread of communism, World War II, the Holocaust, the Cold War, everything could have been prevented.
As early as 1917, the Virgin Mary implicated those responsible for these historic events.
Our Lady said Russia will spread her errors all over the world.
A disturbing denunciation as its repercussions still shape our contemporary history. Behind the apparitions of the Virgin Mary, in Fatima lies the deepest enigma of the 20th century.
What has made the secret of Fatima so successful is the silence around it, the mystery.
To this day, the idea remains that not everything was said, that documents were falsified, and that the Church continues to hide things.
Which is true. They must be hiding something. But what?
For more than a century, hundreds of books and articles have attempted to unravel the mystery of Mary's apparitions. And, above all, to reveal her secret. Whether in black and white or in color, all the images tell the same story, that of a site with exceptional religious fervor. Located in Portugal, some 100 kilometers from Lisbon, the city of Fatima welcomes 8 million Christians each year who come to pray to the Virgin Mary, Mother of Jesus. Until 1917, however, this gigantic white open-air esplanade was only a field. What happened to turn this wild countryside into an immense place of worship dedicated to the Virgin Mary? The story begins a few kilometers from Fatima, in the small village of Aljustrel, where 3 children lived, Lucia and 2 of her cousins, Jacinta and Francisco.
They were between 7 and 10 years old. They were shepherds. It was a rural environment where piety was very present. They were extremely devoted.
They were not what you would call cultured. On the contrary, they were uncultured but very religious because they went to church, and Lucia, compared to the others, seemed to be particularly motivated by her faith.
Religious celebrations and the raising of sheep punctuated the daily lives of these 3 children from a modest background. That Sunday, May 13th, 1917, began as an ordinary day.
Lucia and her cousins were watching their flock graze, as they did every day. Suddenly, they saw a flash of light.
And suddenly, at 12 high noon, a flash appeared, a flash of light. And they said, "Oh my God, this must be a thunderstorm coming." You know, when you ever took care for a herd of sheep, you know what it means. You really have to guide them back to the stable.
Then they saw a second flash. Beside an oak tree, they approached and saw a woman. She was radiant in the literal sense. There were rays of light coming out of her that were more radiant than anything you can imagine. They immediately understood that it was the Virgin Mary standing before them.
Captivated by Mary's extraordinary beauty, the 3 shepherds paid rapt attention to her words. What would this divine figure tell them?
The Virgin Mary had an important message. She said that she was there for them, that she would return to this very location, and that they should pray for peace.
This was the most common request of any apparition, even more so in 1917, in the middle of the war. The first Portuguese soldier sent to the front had just fallen in battle. This caused great emotion in the country, of course.
In 1917, the Portuguese population was desperate for hope. World War I seemed like it would never end. In addition to the global conflict, riots were occurring inside the country. For years, part of the population had been attempting to get rid of the church's grip on society. It finally happened in 1910, when the monarchy was overthrown and the first secular republic of Portugal was born. This desire to make a clean break with religion caused anguish in the rural and highly pious world to which Lucia and her cousins belonged.
When they were told that Mary, Jesus, and the other stories were a thing of the past, they were in complete disarray. They obviously continued to believe, especially in the Virgin Mary. To them, she was someone in whom you could confide and ask for things.
But on May 13th, 1917, when she appeared in Fatima for the first time, it was the Virgin Mary who made a unique request of the 3 shepherds.
What distinguishes the apparitions of the Virgin Mary in Fatima is the notion of appointments. Mary told the children to return on the 13th of each month and that she would meet them there.
Lucia, Jacinta, and Francisco were asked to return 6 times in a row after May 13th. At the same time, on the 13th day of each month. It was a very precise monthly appointment with Mary, which the shepherds obediently kept.
In this way, the Virgin Mary took charge of the situation. She was in control, not the children.
But that's not all. Mary went further. 3 months later, she is said to have confided to them what would be known in history as the secret of Fatima.
The third apparition on July 13th, 1917, is one of the most famous because it was on this day that she revealed to them the famous three-part secret.
What was this unique secret divided into three parts that the Virgin Mary chose to entrust to Lucia, Jacinta, and Francisco?
Overall, the content was apocalyptic. It had to deal with the end of the world. One that wasn't very cheerful. The first part was a description of hell. There's a kind of underground sea of fire in which are demons and the souls of the damned. It's a fairly classic depiction of hell, one that's already found in the Bible.
The second part of the secret, revealed by the Virgin Mary to Lucia and her cousins, would be even more dramatic. On July 13th, 1917, the Virgin detailed what would happen over the course of the 20th century by revealing a political prophecy to the children.
She said, the war will come to an end soon. But if mankind continues to sin, another war will happen, and it will be much more terrible than the one before.
In speaking of this chaos, the Virgin Mary went so far as to name one country in particular.
Our Lady said, Russia will spread her errors all over the world.
As for the third and final part, it was the most difficult message of the secret to interpret, as it was the most symbolic.
There's the angel of death with a flaming sword who's been sent to destroy the planet. And then the Holy Father, the Pope, is forced to go around the corpses as he crosses the city. He sees a mountain and wants to climb it, but he's shot by soldiers and dies.
Did the spectacular vision foreshadow the tragic attack on John Paul II on May 13th, 1981? The Virgin Mary is said to have ordered the children not to reveal the last part of the secret until 1960. In 1917, when the three children received the famous secret, they were forbidden to reveal to the world the contents of the three parts.
One very important element of the secret was the Virgin Mary's instructions not to reveal it to anyone.
Why would Mary order the children not to immediately divulge the secret entrusted to them? It would take over 50 years for all three parts of the secret to be fully revealed. And even today, when everything seems to be known, it isn't that simple. To try to shed light on the Virgin Mary's mysterious secret, we'll pursue several leads. Are we sure of the credibility of the three shepherds? What about the prophecies made by the Virgin Mary in 1917? Was Lucia to be trusted? How are we to interpret the Vatican's strange attitude towards Lucia and the secret she was told? Lucia, Jacinta, and Francisco were the only witnesses to the apparitions of the Virgin Mary in Fatima. The only ones with whom Mary entrusted her secret. But what is the secret worth if the apparitions were made up by the three children? During the first apparition on May 13th, 1917, the one during which the shepherds claimed to have met the Virgin Mary, they were alone with her. But that didn't last. As the months went by, the extraordinary news spread like wildfire, and thousands of people came to attend the children's monthly appointments with the Virgin Mary. But what exactly did the believers see as they followed the three shepherds to their appointments with Mary?
If you'd been there, you would have seen three children kneeling and looking at a shrub. You wouldn't have seen much. Some people mentioned a bit of wind in the trees, a small clap of thunder, or possibly a small white cloud that appeared, but that was all anyone saw.
So how can we be sure that this story wasn't fabricated?
Very quickly, of course, the children's credibility was questioned. Were they telling the truth?
Nothing was less certain. Even the Portuguese clergy were suspicious. In the anti-clerical climate that reigned in Portugal at the beginning of the century, these pseudo-apparitions were talked about often, but discredited the Catholic religion, which was already under attack.
As is often the case with this kind of phenomenon, the Church reacted with great caution, and from the very beginning, attempted to interrogate the children to determine if they were telling the truth.
The investigation was conducted by politicians and priests. They questioned Lucia, Francisco, and Jacinta several times in an attempt to uncover the deception. But to no avail. The children's accounts were identical.
They were so similar that their stories seemed to be real. That is, the children really seemed to have heard and seen a person they said was the Virgin Mary.
Were the three shepherds telling the truth? While the public readily believed the word of the children, the Church and the state continued to question it and even denigrate it. It was then that Lucia, Francisco, and Jacinta asked the Virgin Mary for help.
When they saw Mary again, they told her about the problem, and she told them that she would work a miracle on October 13th, 1917. This was great for the children. All they had to do was announce that Mary would do something amazing on October 13th for everyone to see.
It was a thunderclap that ignited the whole of Portugal. The prospect of this miracle mobilized the crowds. Fervent believers, skeptics, and mockers alike flocked to Fatima to witness the highly anticipated show.
On October 13th, 1917, everyone was there for the sixth apparition of the Virgin Mary in Fatima. They were all waiting for a miracle. They must have expected it to have something to do with the sun, because we know that on that morning, some people took broken glass and passed it through a flame to make smoked glass so they could look directly at the sun.
However, at noon on October 13th, 1917, the sun was nowhere to be seen, and the weather was terrible. There was torrential rainfall and mud everywhere.
You have to try to imagine yourself in their place. They'd been standing in the rain for hours, praying and waiting for something to happen. They were looking at each other. It was like being at Woodstock and waiting for the concert to start, yet nothing was happening.
Nothing, until the rain suddenly stopped and the sun broke through the clouds.
And Lucia said, look at the sun, and suddenly, all 100,000 people saw how the sun started to rotate in many colors, in blue, in green, in pink, in whatever color you can imagine.
Some say they saw the sun move, tremble, or vibrate. Others say that the sun descended and rushed towards the earth before returning to its place in the sky.
People believe this is the end of the world, falling on their knees, praying, confessing their sins.
For about 10 minutes, an incredible supernatural phenomenon, a sun dance, seemed to take place before the astonished gaze of the crowd. But can we trust the spectators who saw the miracle with their own eyes?
We have a lot of testimonies. Tens of thousands of people attended the scene, including journalists and photographers. Among the witnesses to the miracle, one of the most important was the editor-in-chief of the newspaper O Século, who was not only an unbeliever, but also an anti-clerical. However, after seeing this phenomenon, he converted. He became one of the most committed witnesses and strongest supporters of the theory of the supernatural origin of the apparitions.
You had government representatives, spies, Secret Service, police, military. It was even seen in the distance of up to 30, 40 kilometers. So this was undeniable proof.
However, once the exaltation of the moment had passed, a certain perplexity set in. Was this Sundance a simple phenomenon with a scientific explanation?
The sun has cycles that alternate between very intense periods and very calm ones. The cycles are characterized by the number of sunspots that appear on the surface of the sun.
But on October 13th, 1917, the activity of the sun in Fatima seemed to have been quite normal.
Some witnesses tried to translate the movements of the sun into drawings. When you look at them, you really get the impression that the sun was jumping about.
We have no scientific explanation for such rapid movements of the sun in the sky, that's for sure.
But what about the colorful, luminous manifestation supposedly observed by the crowd?
There's a phenomenon that produces a giant luminous ring around the sun called a halo. This halo occurs in specific weather conditions that happen to have been present on that day.
Cold, wet, cloudy weather turns water droplets in the atmosphere into ice crystals. When they pass into the white light of the sun, several different colors appear, forming a luminous, iridescent arc. Collective hallucination or veritable miracle? Was this Sundance proof of the Virgin Mary's supernatural presence in Fatima on October 13th, 1917?
In the end, there may not have been anything miraculous about this solar activity, except perhaps for the timing. It was precisely at that time and date that the sun experienced all of these spectacular manifestations.
To this day, no clear answer has managed to unravel the mystery surrounding the last apparition of the Virgin Mary in Fatima. But no matter. To most Catholics, October 13th, 1917 gave credence to the children's words. The three shepherds seemed to truly be in contact with Mary. While the children appeared to be trustworthy, what about the announcements that the Virgin Mary had made in her famous secret? According to the three shepherds, Mary appeared 6 times in a row in Fatima in 1917. While the Virgin Mary invited them to share some of her words, she strictly forbade them to reveal her famous 3-part secret. Entrusted to Lucia, Jacinta, and Francisco on July 13th, 1917, the 3 parts could only be shared with the world according to a very strict timeline. The first 2 parts of the secret were first on the list. But before looking at the date when these 2 parts were allowed to be divulged, let's revisit their substance. While the first part of the secret offered a familiar vision of hell, the second part predicted a number of disasters for the world.
The message was received in 1917 during World War I and had a dramatic effect because it announced a war even more terrible than the one the world was currently experiencing. It was clearly prophecy, as no one in 1917 could have predicted World War II.
In the midst of World War I, humanity couldn't imagine that a second conflict would break out just 22 years later. Mary seemed to be one step ahead of the unknown events that awaited humankind.
Most notably, World War II, of course, but also the Holocaust, the use of atomic weapons, forced migration, and total disregard for human life. None of this had ever existed before. Yet Mary mysteriously predicted a terrible century, of which she triggered at least an understanding, if not the actual events themselves.
The visionary second part of the Virgin Mary's secret was all the more disturbing, as it designated a main culprit for all of these atrocities: Russia.
What did Russia have to do with all of this? It was 1917, the eve of the Bolshevik Revolution, which would put an end to the Russian Empire, an Orthodox Christian empire, to make way for Soviet Russia, which completely expelled religion.
In July 1917, the wave of secularization affecting Portugal was about to reach Russia in the form of communism, the sworn enemy of Catholicism.
Fatima's messages, as described in these images, contained information that had a political impact on the contemporary world. Russia was clearly the image of a place where it was no longer possible to say, "In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit," where it was no longer possible to pray, and where religious people were persecuted.
By naming Russia, was the Virgin Mary seeking to warn humankind of the threat that hung over their heads?
During World War II, communism was perceived as the instrument used by Russia to spread its mistakes throughout the world. Russia was being asked to return into the past. It had driven out religion and cast out God. Therefore, it had to return to God and put itself in His service.
From World War II to the spread of communism in the East, the Virgin Mary allegedly revealed the main historical event of the 20th century. In July 1917, however, these visions were part of the secret that Mary had strictly forbidden the children to speak of to others.
One may wonder why Mary would choose to confide such a heavy, serious secret to these three children, only to ask them not to tell the people who would clearly be directly affected.
Why did Mary ask for the children to remain silent at the beginning? Again, we don't know.
This silence was very problematic, because the Virgin Mary only gave permission to disclose the first two parts of her secret in 1941. This responsibility fell to the eldest of the three children, Lucia.
The message was received in 1917. It was written down in 1941, more than 20 years later.
If this secret had been revealed to the public in July 1917, it could have been called a prophecy, since it foretold the events that would occur in Russia a few months later. But in this case, Lucia revealed the secret in 1941, meaning after the fact.
What was announced in 1917 was something that actually happened. Even if it wasn't made public, Lucia and the other seers heard it, and Lucia understood it the moment the events took place. So it was an announcement of events to come that were understood once the events had taken place.
As a result, we can call it a prophecy. It spoke of something that had just happened, the Russian Revolution. They were in the middle of World War II. It was Stalin's Russia. History was underway.
But what part of history exactly? As the meaning of the Virgin Mary's words came into question, the contours of the Russia she spoke of became increasingly blurred.
Russia was directly mentioned in the message, but without further details.
When Mary spoke of Russia, she designated it as responsible for sowing disorder in the world. But which Russia was she talking about?
In July 1917, the Tsar had just been overthrown, but it was not yet Bolshevik Russia. That name didn't appear until October 1917. So when Russia was mentioned, it was a kind of timeless Russia that could be applied to all of the events that Russia experienced during the 20th century.
Was this the Russia of her time? Was it the USSR? Was it Putin's Russia? The question remains unanswered. We don't know.
The armed conflict between Russia and Ukraine has once again opened the door to all kinds of interpretations. What if the Russia mentioned by Mary in the second part of her secret was in fact that of the 21st century?
Our Lady predicted all the atrocities which happened in the 20th century and most probably will happen in the future. Nobody could predict that Russia would invade Ukraine, and nobody could predict a return of a Cold War. Nobody could predict.
Is Pope Francis's prayer addressed to Russia and Ukraine on March 25th, 2022, 1 month after the beginning of the war, to be interpreted as a sign of recognition by the Vatican of the secret link that unites Mary's vision to the implacable unfolding of history?
So this is the risk that the prophecy you believe refers to the past might indeed have referred to the future.
A future of which Lucia, the oldest of the three shepherds, would be the main messenger. From the very first apparitions in Fatima in 1917, Lucia received more messages from the Virgin Mary than Francisco or Jacinta. She played a privileged role that was only exacerbated in 1919, when her two cousins died prematurely of the Spanish flu. The secret, entrusted by the Virgin Mary to the three shepherds, was therefore left in the hands of Lucia alone.
Very early on, Lucia became the only seer left alive, the only one who knew the message, the only one who had experienced the apparitions and could truly convey what had happened.
Was Lucia the holder of such power to be trusted? How can we be sure of her credibility?
Lucia was the only one of the three children left alive, so she could say whatever she wanted. Who could confirm the secrets were as she said? Who could say that the Virgin Mary told her exactly that? No one.
Especially since Lucia recorded her memoirs in writing starting in 1935. Remember that the Virgin Mary had instructed her not to put her secret on paper until much later. The first two parts of the secret were written down in 1941, 24 years after the fact.
It was in her third memoir that Lucia wrote down the secret of Fatima for the first time. It only included the first and second parts of secret. She clearly stated that the secret consisted of 3 distinct parts and that she would reveal only 2.
The third part of the secret, which presaged the assassination attempt on John Paul II, was written down 3 years later, in 1944.
When Lucia's first writings appeared, that's when the question arose of whether or not she was reliable and credible. Did she exaggerate? Was her imagination playing tricks on her? Was her memory as faithful as she said?
The question arose because an examination of the many texts written by Lucia reveals that some are convoluted and even contradictory, starting with what Lucia said about the second part of the secret. In this message, the Virgin Mary not only prophesied the coming of World War II and denounced Russia, but also gave very clear instructions to avoid the worst, and in particular, the consecration of Russia to her Immaculate Heart.
What does it mean to consecrate Russia to the Immaculate Heart?
Consecration is a gift given to the Virgin Mary. Russia would be put in her hands, and she would be asked to watch over it and its people, who would trust the Virgin Mary to help settle the tragedies that the country was experiencing.
And this gift, or consecration, had to meet some very strict criteria.
The first was that it be carried out by the Pope. The second was that he do it in agreement with all the bishops of the world. And the third was that Russia be explicitly named as the object of this consecration.
For over 40 years, Lucia tried countless approaches and made many efforts with various popes to obtain the accord of the Vatican, all in vain.
None of the consecrations done by Paul VI met with these 3 specific criteria. And each time, Lucia said they were invalid.
She asked for some very specific things that were never fully validated by the papacy. Whoever the Pope was, it was never entirely right.
As the guardian of the clear conditions set by the Virgin Mary for the realization of this prayer, Lucia was intractable. On March 25, 1984, it was John Paul II's turn to attempt to fulfill Mary's request. Yet despite his desire to do the right thing, John Paul II omitted one of the crucial conditions that had been put in place by the Virgin Mary.
In 1984, Pope John Paul II did not explicitly pronounce the name of Russia. Instead, he mentioned only the people awaiting consecration.
Yet, against all expectations, the Portuguese shepherdess validated the prayer.
Lucia came out in favor of it. She clearly stated that the consecration had been accepted by heaven.
It's not clear why this consecration, which didn't meet the Virgin Mary's conditions any more than any of the previous attempts, was suddenly considered valid.
What was going on in Lucia's mind? Had the Virgin Mary changed her requirements? Lucia would never shed any light on this reversal. Even stranger is the vagueness that reigned over the year 1960, when the enigmatic third part of the secret would finally be revealed to the general public. Why this date?
At times, Lucia said that she couldn't reveal the secret until 1960, because it wouldn't be fully understood until then.
Lucia contradicted herself several times. She said that the Virgin wanted the third part of the secret to be announced in 1960. An exact date was not given, only a year.
But later, she said that she had chosen the date of her own accord, because she thought she would be dead by then.
She said 1960. Then she said maybe a little later, because the world wasn't ready yet.
How were we to interpret these vacillations? For some, they discredited Lucia's word, but for others, they were the very proof of her sincerity.
Had this been an elaborate and very detailed text, these small contradictions would have been eliminated. It's precisely because it's not a deliberately constructed or programmed testimony that these small contradictions ended up arising.
What if the origin of these contradictions lies elsewhere? To some, these inconsistencies are a sign of the Vatican's hold on the young woman, who became a nun at age 22.
She had to obey her superiors. Might that have influenced her writings?
There's no evidence that Lucia didn't have full freedom when writing her memoirs.
Lucia was also caught in contradictions because sometimes she was asked to speak and other times to be silent. We can see that her position changed throughout her lifetime.
Was Lucia really in control of her own destiny? The shadow of the Vatican seemed to emerge behind the writing and transmission of the three-part secret entrusted to her by the Virgin Mary. Faced with the popular piety that flooded Fatima, the Vatican was very cautious at first. It wasn't until 1930 that it officially recognized the apparitions of the Virgin Mary in Portugal. But beyond this canonical approval, its attitude towards Lucia, the only survivor and sole holder of the Virgin Mary's secret, remained enigmatic. Lucia put the Vatican in a quandary.
Why? Because the clergy is supposed to be the intermediary between God and humankind. If God reveals himself to mankind, if the Virgin Mary reveals herself to us, it's supposed to be through priests, bishops, or the Pope, not through a little shepherdess. And so, the Vatican sometimes tried to cover up the affair and sometimes tried to control and guide Lucia.
Even once she was isolated in a monastery, Lucia allegedly continued to receive messages from the Virgin Mary, which the young woman intended to reveal to the world through the Pope.
Lucia's primary method to approach the popes and forward her requests, and those she had received from heaven, was a series of letters she sent to the Roman pontiffs.
What was the Vatican to do with the content of these letters? Listen to the prophecies of the Virgin Mary as recorded by Lucia, or ignore them? It was a particularly difficult dilemma, given the third, most secret part of the message from Mary.
In 1944, Lucia fell seriously ill, so much so that the Bishop of Lleida and his confessor pressured her to reveal the third part of the secret that had so far remained untold.
Although it was the most occult vision, the one the content of which no one was supposed to know before 1960, the nun complied.
She wrote down the third part of the secret in strict obedience to the bishop of the diocese, who gave her clear orders.
Lucia placed the pages in an envelope, sealed by the bishop, which he sent to the Vatican. When the fateful year arrived, impatience was at its height among Catholic Christians. The third secret of Fatima was finally about to be revealed to the whole world.
When the famous deadline of 1960 arrived, John the 23rd was Pope. He took note of the secret, but decided not to publish it, simply saying that it didn't concern his pontificate, but rather a subsequent one. This was a blow to all of the followers of Fatima who were hoping for the secret to be revealed. Afterwards, several more popes consulted the third part of the secret, but did nothing about it.
For 20 years, the Vatican hid the final part of the secret in its archives. What was this silence hiding? Indifference, caution, or fear?
There are two options regarding the third secret. Either it really didn't interest the papacy and the Vatican because they found that there was no point in revealing the information, or on the contrary, it contained something that could harm the Church or even humanity.
From her monastery, Lucia undertook multiple initiatives with various popes to get them to unveil the text. By 1981, when John Paul II recognized his own fate in that of the Bishop in White, mentioned in the Virgin's prophecy, it was too late.
The attack on John Paul II changed the situation, because having had access to the secret of Fatima, the Pope interpreted the attack in light of this secret. Ali Agsa, the one who fired, always said he had aimed accurately.
Ali Agsa said, "Sir, you shouldn't have to be alive while you're still alive. I'm a professional killer. I killed you and you're still alive. What happened?"
John Paul II therefore believed that the Virgin Mary had deflected the bullet.
Whether or not you believe in the apparitions of the Virgin Mary and Fatima and her secrets, there are some astonishing coincidences. For example, the date of the attack on Pope John Paul II was May 13th, 1981. May 13th was also the date of the first apparition of the Virgin in Fatima.
But there's something even more disturbing. After the tragedy, John Paul II wanted to express his gratitude to the Virgin Mary in Portugal.
Later, John Paul II went to Fatima. He donated the bullet that had wounded him during the attack. The bullet was placed in the crown of the statue, and the bullet fit perfectly into the setting, as if it had been designed for this very purpose.
It was as if the bullet had been waiting to find its place since 1917. After the attack, John Paul II vowed to Lucia to finally make the prophecy public. But the press conference, during which the entirety of the third part of the message was finally read to the general public, didn't take place until June 26, 2000, some 21 years later.
The Church took a long time to react. If Pope John Paul II had decided that was the third part of the secret of Fatima, he could have said so very quickly, even from his hospital bed.
But another 20 years passed before the general public was informed of the third part of the secret. Why keep it silent for so long?
Knowingly forgotten, even by John Paul II, the envelope containing the famous secret of the Virgin Mary remained trapped in the Vatican archives. Why did the Holy See refuse to share the message of the Virgin?
The third part of the message, that of the man in white who's shot, is also kind of delicate because it gives an apocalyptic vision of the Church. It can arouse fears, and it shows a version of the Church that is weakened.
This vision is absolutely apocalyptic. Having the Church of Rome speak about the end of the Christian religion isn't the best in terms of PR.
The end of the Vatican? Why not? Especially since the official interpretation of the prophecy has been called into question. When John Paul II recognized himself in it, others see many inconsistencies with the events of 1981.
He considered himself the Fatima Pope. Today we are not sure about it. It might also refer to the future, to a future event.
If you take the third part of the secret and read it in its entirety, it doesn't appear to have anything to do with the assassination attempt on Pope John Paul II in 1981. It seems completely off the mark.
This all did not happen in 1981 yet. So there's quite some concern in the Vatican and in the Fatima community. But it will refer to a future event.
With its multitude of dramatic details, the prophecy reported by Lucia could correspond to other terrible events to come. Events that the Vatican might not have wanted to reveal at the press conference.
To this day, after the entire message of Fatima has been shared and explained, the idea remains that not everything was said, that documents were falsified, and that the Church continues to hide things.
Could the Vatican have changed the message written in 1944? Or even substituted one paper for another with Lucia's complicity?
It obviously raises a little more suspicion about the Church. And naturally, conspiracy theorists will have a blast and say they're hiding something from us, which is true. They must be hiding something, but what?
The secret contained in the third part of the Virgin Mary's message seems as well guarded as ever. It's impossible to disentangle the truth from the falsehoods. In this saga full of twists and turns, the only certainty is the unwavering devotion that the apparitions of the Virgin Mary in 1917 seem to have aroused in thousands of pilgrims. Even shrouded in mystery, Mary's three-part secret speaks to the hearts of Christians.
It's a message of hope and faith. It's a message of encouragement for humankind in the midst of wars and tribulations to hold firm to the conviction that peace will prevail in spite of everything.
Our Lady did not promise eternal peace, but only a period of peace, which for sure we had. 3 decades of peace.
The conflict opposing Europe and Russia since the Russian-Ukrainian War makes the secret of the Virgin Mary of Fatima more relevant than ever.
This is a message that's anchored in the present and that's also able to speak to the people of 1940, 1980, and the early 2020s.